So just quickly, I'd like to talk about a commentary I was reading on Philippians 2 by Dr. Walter Hansen, a graduate of Wheaton College, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and Wycliffe College. In other words, he's a staunch Trinitarian is the point. But in his commentary, he makes a good comparison between the famous so-called Philippian hymn, Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11, and the suffering servant songs of Isaiah. So that's Isaiah 42 to chapters 53. In Philippians 2 verse 7, Paul says that the Messiah was in the form of a servant. Isaiah 52 verses 13 and 14 says, "Behold my servant, his form marred beyond human likeness." In Philippians 2 verse 8, Paul says that the Messiah humbled himself, and Isaiah 53 verse 8 says the servant of the Lord in his humiliation, justice was denied to him. And then in Philippians 2 verses 7 and 8, Paul says that the Messiah poured out or emptied himself by becoming obedient unto death. And then we read in Isaiah 53 verse 12 that the servant poured out his soul, that is himself, unto death. According to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the Greek phrase translated emptied himself in verse 7 is an expression that is not attested elsewhere in Greek. And it's an exact translation of the Hebrew of Isaiah 53 verse 12, his soul he poured out. So the expression he emptied himself implies the surrender of life, obviously dying, and not the kenosis of the incarnation. Now, what is this kenosis? Well, this is also known as the kenosis theory, which teaches that in order to assume or take on flesh, God the Son, quote unquote, emptied himself of certain powers and abilities. A lot of Trinitarians, that's how they understand the emptying that's going on here. And then in Philippians 2 verse 9, Paul says that God has highly exalted the Messiah. Isaiah 52 verse 13 says that the servant will be exalted and lifted up and will be very high. The Philippian hymn ends with the famous, "Every knee will bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is the Lord Messiah." Now this final declaration by Paul is not about the suffering servant, but something God himself says. So in Isaiah 45, verse 23, God says, "Before me, every knee will bow. By me," that is by God, "every tongue will swear or confess." This is part of a well-known practice by Paul of applying so-called Yahweh texts to Jesus. So we must be careful to note the context where such verses are used by Paul. In this case, every knee will bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is the Lord Messiah, not the Lord God, let alone the anointed Messiah Yahweh. That's not what Paul is saying here, just because he applies this so-called Yahweh text to Jesus. Luke 2:11 identifies Jesus as the anointed, that is the Messiah Lord. And Luke 2:26 calls Jesus the Lord's, that is God's Messiah from birth. So this is how Jesus is to be worshipped, not only from now on, but until the kingdom comes, as that anointed human servant of the Lord God. And of course, everything, as Paul himself ends the so-called Philippian hymn in Philippians 2:11, everything to the glory of that only one God who remains the Father.